The desert wind howled through the abandoned mine shaft, carrying with it the scent of sage and the distant echo of gunshots that had changed 5 lives forever. Deep in the Colorado mountains, where the ghost towns of failed mining claims dotted, the landscape like broken dreams, the Henderson sisters pressed themselves against the cold stone walls and listened to the sounds of their world falling apart above ground. What they didn't know was that their father's silver marshal's badge, hidden in the darkness beside them, would soon attract the attention of the one man who could either save them or seal their fate forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty Colorado territory as the Wells Fargo stagecoach creaked and swayed along the mountain trail toward Silver Creek. Inside the cramped passenger compartment, 5 sisters sat pressed together on worn leather seats, their traveling dresses already dusty from 2 days of hard riding through some of the roughest country in the American West. Margaret Henderson, at 24, the eldest of the sisters, adjusted her dark blue traveling bonnet and tried to project the confidence their desperate situation required. Her green eyes, sharp with intelligence and determination, surveyed their fellow passengers while her mind calculated the dwindling contents of their shared purse. The death of their father, Marshal William Henderson, 3 months earlier, had left them with little more than his reputation, his badge, and a letter from their aunt promising them refuge in the silver mining town of Silver Creek. "How much further do you think it is, Maggie?" whispered 18-year-old Sarah, the youngest of the Henderson sisters. Her blonde hair escaped in wisps from beneath her simple cotton bonnet, and her blue eyes reflected the anxiety they all felt about their uncertain future. The journey from Kansas had consumed most of their modest inheritance, leaving them dependent on the charity of an aunt they had never met. "The driver said we'd reach Silver Creek by evening," Margaret replied, quietly, not wanting to disturb the other passengers who shared their cramped quarters. Across from them sat a traveling salesman whose sample cases took up precious floor space, and beside him a stern-faced woman in black who had introduced herself as a widow, traveling to claim her late husband's mining interest. 22-year-old Elizabeth Henderson shifted uncomfortably on the hard seat, her practical brown dress wrinkled from the long journey. As the second eldest, she had always been the family's voice of reason, but even her usual optimism was strained by their circumstances. Aunt Clara's letter said Silver Creek was a proper town with schools and churches, she said, more to reassure Sarah than from any real confidence. Surely there will be opportunities for young women willing to work. 19-year-old Catherine Henderson, whose auburn hair and quick wit had always made her their father's favorite, peered out the dusty window at the towering mountain peaks that surrounded them. "It's beautiful country," she observed, though her voice carried undertones of worry. "But it seems awfully isolated. What if Aunt Clara has changed her mind about taking us in?" The question that had haunted all their thoughts since leaving Kansas hung in the air like the dust kicked up by the stagecoach wheels. Their father's sister had written offering them a home, but that letter was 4 months old, and communications with frontier settlements were notoriously unreliable. 20-year-old Mary Henderson, the quietest of the sisters, clutched their shared carpetbag closer to her chest. Inside, wrapped carefully in her father's spare shirt, lay Marshal William Henderson's silver badge, the symbol of the law and order he had brought to 3 different frontier towns during his career. Mary had insisted on bringing it, though none of them were sure why. Perhaps it represented the hope that their father's reputation might open doors in Silver Creek, or perhaps it was simply too precious to leave behind. The stagecoach lurched, suddenly, as the wheels hit a particularly deep rut, throwing the passengers against each other and prompting muttered curses from the driver above. Margaret steadied Sarah with one arm while gripping the leather strap with her other hand. her mind racing through contingency plans they couldn't afford to implement. "Ladies," said the traveling salesman, a portly man named Jeremiah Walsh, who had been trying to engage them in conversation since Denver. "I couldn't help but overhear your concerns about Silver Creek. I've been through there several times in my business, and I can assure you it's a thriving community. The silver mines have brought considerable prosperity to the area." Elizabeth leaned forward with interest. "Are there many families in Silver Creek, Mr. Walsh? We're hoping to establish ourselves respectably, perhaps through teaching or seamstress work." Walsh nodded enthusiastically. "Oh, yes, quite a few families. The mine owners have built proper houses for their supervisors, and there's even talk of bringing in a railroad spur within the next few years. A town with such prospects always needs educated young ladies like yourselves." The widow woman, who had introduced herself only as Mrs. Blackwood, snorted dismissively. "Prosperity built on silver has a way of disappearing when the veins run dry," she said in a voice sharp with experience. "I've seen too many boom towns become ghost towns to put much faith in mining riches." Her pessimism cast a shadow over the conversation, but Margaret refused to let discouragement take hold. "Mrs. Blackwood, surely Silver Creek has advantages beyond just mining. The location seems ideal for serving travelers through the mountains, and with proper development." "Child," Mrs. Blackwood interrupted, her dark eyes reflecting hard-won wisdom. "I've buried 2 husbands in mining towns. The first died in a cave-in at Leadville, the second shot dead over a claim dispute in Cripple Creek. If you're looking for security and respectability, you'd be better served going back east, where civilized society still means something." Ma harsh assessment of their prospects sent a chill through the sisters that had nothing to do with the mountain air. They had no money to go back east, no family to return to, and no alternatives if Silver Creek proved unwelcoming. Catherine, never one to back down from a challenge, straightened in her seat. "Mrs. Blackwood, with respect, our father was Marshal, William Henderson. He spent 15 years bringing law and order to frontier communities just like Silver Creek. We understand the risks, but we also understand that someone has to build civilization in these places." Mrs. Blackwood's expression softened slightly at the mention of their father's profession. "A lawman's daughters, are you? That explains the backbone you're showing. Your father was a brave man to take on such work, but I hope he prepared you for the realities of what happens to families when the law isn't strong enough to protect them." Margaret felt a familiar pang of grief mixed with pride at the mention of their father. Marshal Henderson had indeed been a brave man, gunned down in the street of Dodge City while trying to arrest a cattle rustler who had killed a shopkeeper. His death had been sudden, violent, and financially devastating for his daughters. "Papa always said that civilization follows the railroad and the law," Sarah said quietly, her young voice carrying an echo of their father's convictions. "He believed that good people working together could build something lasting even in the hardest places." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the driver shouting to his horses and the sudden deceleration of the stagecoach. Through the windows, they could see that the narrow mountain trail ahead was blocked by several large boulders that hadn't been there on the regular route. "Road's blocked," called the driver from above. "Gonna have to move some rocks before we can get through." Jeremiah Walsh peered out the window with concern. "That's odd. This route is maintained by the Territorial Road Commission. Those boulders look like they were placed deliberately." Mrs. Blackwood's face went pale, and her hand moved instinctively toward her traveling bag. "Girls," she said in a voice suddenly tight with fear, "get down on the floor and stay quiet. Those rocks weren't moved by nature." Before anyone could respond to her alarming instruction, the crack of rifle fire split the mountain air. The driver's shout of surprise was cut short by a heavy thud as his body hit the ground beside the stagecoach. "Nobody move!" roared a voice from the rocks above the trail. "This is a robbery! Everyone out with your hands up!" Margaret's heart pounded as she looked at her four sisters, seeing her own terror reflected in their faces. This was exactly the kind of danger their father had always warned them about, the lawlessness that plagued isolated frontier routes where desperate men preyed on travelers. "Stay calm," she whispered, though her own voice shook. "Do exactly what they say. No money is worth our lives." Through the windows, they could see at least 4 armed men emerging from concealment among the rocks, their faces covered by bandanas and their rifles trained on the stagecoach. The leader, a tall man in a black hat, approached the coach door. With predatory confidence, "Come on out, folks," he called, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to terrorizing others. "Make this easy on yourselves and nobody else needs to get hurt." As Margaret reached for the door handle with trembling fingers, she caught sight of Mary clutching their carpet bag protectively against her chest. Inside that bag, their father's Marshal badge seemed to burn like a beacon of everything these outlaws represented the destruction of. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether the Henderson sisters would survive to honor their father's memory or become another tragic tale of the violent frontier. The door swung open, and Margaret Henderson stepped out into the Colorado sunlight to face the men who held their lives in their hands. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The mountain. Air felt thin and sharp in Margaret's lungs as she stepped down from the stagecoach, her hands raised as instructed. The 4 armed bandits spread out in a semicircle around the disabled coach, their weapons trained on the passengers with practiced efficiency that spoke of experience in this deadly trade. "That's right, lady," growled the leader, a lanky man, whose dark eyes glittered with cruel amusement above his bandana. "Nice and slow. You other folks come on out too." Elizabeth emerged next, her practical nature taking over as she carefully helped Sarah down from the high step. The youngest Henderson sister's face was pale with terror, but she bit her lip to keep from crying out. Catherine followed, her auburn hair catching the afternoon sunlight as she surveyed their captors with the sharp intelligence that had always gotten her into trouble. Mary came last, still clutching the carpet bag that contained their father's badge and what little money they had left. Her quiet demeanor served her well now, as she managed to appear smaller and less significant than her sisters, drawing little attention from the outlaws. Jeremiah Walsh emerged with his hands trembling, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Gentlemen, please," he stammered. "I'm just a traveling salesman. I don't carry much money, but you're welcome to what I have." Mrs. Blackwood stepped down with grim dignity, her black dress and stern expression making her look like a mourner at her own funeral. "Get on with it then," she said coldly to the bandits. "If you're going to rob us, rob us. But there's no need for theatrics," the leader laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the surrounding mountain walls. "Well now, ain't she a feisty one? I like a woman with spirit." His gaze shifted to the Henderson sisters, lingering on each face with an appreciation that made Margaret's skin crawl. "And what have we here? 5 pretty little doves all in a row." A shorter bandit with nervous eyes and tobacco-stained teeth stepped closer to examine their traveling bags. "Boss, look at this. These ladies are dressed nice, but their luggage says they ain't got much money. Probably not worth our time." "Everything's worth our time, Charlie," the leader replied, his voice carrying an edge of menace. "Besides, sometimes the best treasures are the ones that don't look like much at first glance." Margaret forced herself to speak, her voice steadier than she felt. "Sir, we're traveling to Silver Creek to live with family. We have very little money, but you're welcome to what we have if you'll just let us continue on our way." The leader studied her with predatory interest. "Silver Creek? Huh? That's a mighty prosperous town for folks who claim to be poor. What kind of family you got there, sweetheart?" Before Margaret could answer, Catherine stepped forward slightly, her temper overriding her caution. Our family circumstances are none of your concern. If you want to rob us, then do it and let us go." The bandit's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Got some fire in you, don't you, Red? I appreciate that in a woman." He gestured to his companions. "Boys, collect everything valuable from these nice folks. Check every bag, every pocket, every hiding place they might have." The systematic search that followed was humiliating and terrifying. The bandits dumped out the contents of every bag and case, scattering the Henderson sisters' few precious belongings across the dusty ground. Jeremiah Walsh's sample cases were rifled through, yielding only a few dollars and some worthless merchandise. Mrs. Blackwood surrendered a small purse with obvious reluctance, but Margaret noticed the older woman managed to palm something small before handing over her bag. The widow's eyes met hers briefly, and Margaret saw a flash of cunning that suggested Mrs. Blackwood was not as helpless as she appeared. When Charlie reached for Mary's carpetbag, the quiet sister instinctively pulled it closer to her chest. The movement caught the leader's attention immediately. "What's in that bag that's so special, little mouse?" he demanded, striding over to Mary with renewed interest. "Something you don't want us to see." Mary's face went white, but she shook her head mutely. Margaret stepped forward to protect her youngest adult sister, but the leader backhanded her casually, sending her stumbling. "Stay back, Blondie, unless you want worse than that," he snarled. Then his attention returned to Mary. "Hand over that! A bag, girl, or my friend here is going to take it from you in a way you won't like." With shaking hands, Mary surrendered the carpetbag. Margaret watched in horror as the bandit dumped out their father's badge, which caught the sunlight like a silver star. The sight of it lying in the dirt seemed to drain all the strength from her legs. The leader picked up the badge and examined it with growing interest. "Well, well, well, Marshal William Henderson." He looked up at the sisters with new appreciation. "You ladies are lawman's daughters, ain't you?" Elizabeth found her voice. "Our father is dead. That badge means nothing to anyone but us." "Dead, huh?" The leader's grin was visible even above his bandana. "I heard about Marshal Henderson. Got himself shot down in Dodge City couple months back. Man had quite a reputation for being hard on folks like us." A chill ran through Margaret as she realized their situation had just become infinitely more dangerous. These weren't just random road agents looking for quick money. The leader's recognition of their father's name suggested connections to the criminal underworld that Marshal Henderson had spent his career fighting. "Boss," said the nervous bandit called Charlie, "maybe we should just take their money and let them go. Getting mixed up with a dead lawman's family could bring us trouble we don't need." The leader studied the badge thoughtfully, then looked at each sister in turn. "Or it could bring us opportunity. See, Marshal Henderson cost our organization a lot of good men over the years, sent some friends of mine to territorial prison, got others killed resisting arrest. Maybe it's time his family paid some of those debts." Mrs. Blackwood spoke up with icy authority. "Young man, you've robbed us. You've humiliated us. But if you harm these girls, you'll have every lawman in Colorado hunting you down like the dogs." "You are." The leader laughed again. "Lady, most of the lawmen in Colorado couldn't find their own boots in the dark. Besides, accidents happen all the time on these mountain roads. Stagecoaches fall off cliffs, passengers disappear, bodies are never found." Margaret felt panic rising in her chest as she grasped the full implications of their situation. These men weren't planning to just rob them and leave. They intended to kill all the passengers to prevent identification and to satisfy some twisted desire for revenge against their father's memory. "Please," Sarah whispered, tears finally spilling down her young face. "We never hurt anyone. We just want to reach our family." The leader was about to respond when a shout from the mountain trail above caught everyone's attention. "Riders coming!" called a lookout they hadn't seen before. "Looks like a posse, maybe 6 or 7 men." The leader cursed viciously, his plans for extended torment suddenly disrupted by the approach of potential rescue. "How far out?" he shouted back. "Maybe 10 minutes at the pace they're riding." Margaret felt a surge of desperate hope. Perhaps someone had heard the gunshots, or maybe the stagecoach was overdue at its next station. But the leader's next words: "Crush that hope immediately. Can't leave witnesses," he said to his men. "Kill them all and let's get out of here." The bandits raised their weapons, and Margaret found herself staring down the barrel of a rifle held by a man who clearly felt no more compunction about killing 5 young women than he would about swatting flies. It was Mrs. Blackwood who saved them all. The widow woman suddenly threw herself at Charlie, the nervous bandit, screaming at the top of her lungs, "Run, girls! Run for the mineshaft!" Her unexpected attack created just enough confusion for Margaret to grab Sarah's hand and shout to her other sisters, "The old mine! Follow me!" The sisters ran toward a dark opening in the mountainside that Margaret had noticed earlier, an abandoned mine shaft that offered the only possible shelter within reach. Behind them, gunshots rang out as the bandits tried to stop their escape while dealing with Mrs. Blackwood's desperate attack. Catherine stumbled and nearly fell, but Elizabeth caught her arm and hauled her forward. Mary ran with surprising speed despite her usual quiet demeanor, clutching one of their scattered bags that she had managed to snatch from the ground. The mine shaft opening loomed ahead, a black mouth in the mountainside that might offer sanctuary or might prove to be their tomb. Margaret plunged into the darkness without hesitation, pulling Sarah with her while praying that the tunnel would lead somewhere safe. Behind them, Mrs. Blackwood's screams had stopped, and Margaret knew with sick certainty that the brave widow woman had paid the ultimate price for giving them a chance to escape. The sound of pursuing footsteps echoed off the tunnel walls as the bandits followed them into the darkness. "Deeper!" Margaret gasped, feeling her way along the rough stone walls. "We have to go deeper!" The 5 Henderson sisters stumbled forward into the black depths of the abandoned mine, their father's badge still in the hands of killers above ground, while somewhere behind them, in the mountain wilderness, the sound of approaching horses suggested that help might be coming too late to save anyone. The abandoned mine shaft swallowed the Henderson sisters like the throat of some ancient stone beast. The darkness was absolute, pressing against their eyes with an almost physical weight as they stumbled deeper into the tunnel, their hands outstretched to feel for walls, obstacles, or the sudden drop that could send them plummeting into an unseen abyss. "Margaret!" Sarah's voice came out as a terrified whisper that seemed to echo endlessly in the confined space. "I can't see anything." "Stay close to the wall," Margaret replied, her own voice tight with controlled panic. "Everyone hold hands. We can't get separated in here." The 5 sisters formed a human chain, with Margaret leading and Sarah bringing up the rear. The tunnel floor was treacherous, littered with loose rocks and broken timbers from the mine's operational days. More than once, one of them stumbled over debris, sending small avalanches of stone clattering into the darkness ahead. "Listen," Elizabeth whispered suddenly, causing them all to freeze in place. Behind them, faint but growing stronger, came the sound of boots on stone and harsh voices calling to each other. The bandits had followed them into the mine, their lantern light, creating dancing shadows that hadn't yet reached the sisters' position but were getting closer. "There's got to be another way out of this rat hole," came the leader's voice, distorted by the tunnel acoustics but still recognizable. "Charlie, you and Jake check that side passage. Me and Brock will follow the main shaft." Catherine squeezed Elizabeth's hand tighter. "How deep do these mines usually go?" she breathed. "Deep enough to get lost forever," came Mary's quiet response from the middle of their chain. In her free hand, she still clutched the bag she had managed to grab during their escape, though none of them knew what it contained. Margaret made a decision that would save their lives. Instead of continuing straight down the main tunnel where the bandits would inevitably find them, she guided her sisters toward a narrow side passage she felt with her outstretched hand. The opening was barely wide enough for them to squeeze. Through single file. "This way," she whispered, quickly and quietly. The side tunnel was even more treacherous than the main shaft. The ceiling was lower, forcing them to duck in places, and the walls seemed to close in around them like a stone fist. But it had one crucial advantage. It angled sharply away from the main excavation, creating a maze of interconnected passages that would be nearly impossible for their pursuers to search systematically. As they navigated the narrow confines, Elizabeth's practical mind began working on their survival. "We need to find water," she whispered. "These old mines usually have seepage from underground springs. Without water, we won't last long down here." "How long do you think they'll keep looking for us?" Catherine asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. Mary, despite her usual quiet nature, had been thinking strategically. "They can't stay long. Mrs. Blackwood mentioned a posse approaching. If they're legitimate lawmen, they'll investigate the stagecoach wreckage and start searching the area." The mention of Mrs. Blackwood brought a moment of silence as each sister privately acknowledged the widow's sacrifice. The older woman had bought their escape with her life, and they all understood the weight of that gift. "She saved us," Sarah said softly. "We have to make sure her sacrifice means something." Margaret felt the passage begin to widen slightly, and her outstretched hand encountered what felt like a timber support beam. "There's some kind of chamber ahead," she reported. "Can everyone hear that?" They stopped to listen, and gradually became aware of a faint sound that hadn't been audible in the narrower tunnel. A soft, rhythmic dripping that suggested water somewhere in the darkness ahead. "Water," Elizabeth said with relief. Thank God. The chamber they discovered was clearly a worked section of the mine, with heavy timber supports holding up the ceiling and evidence of systematic excavation. Most importantly, a small stream of water trickled down one wall and collected in a natural depression in the stone floor. "We can survive here for a while," Margaret said, kneeling beside the water source and cupping the clear liquid in her hands. It tasted of minerals and stone, but it was clean and cold. "The question is, how do we get out without walking into those killers?" Mary opened the bag she had been carrying and carefully felt through its contents in the darkness. Her fingers found their father's spare shirt, some hard biscuits from their travel provisions, and something that made her heart race with possibility. "Margaret," she whispered urgently, "I grabbed Papa's emergency kit when we ran. He always carried it in his saddlebags, but I packed it with his clothes." "What kind of emergency kit?" Catherine asked. Mary's voice carried a note of hope for the first time since the robbery. "Matches, a small lantern, some basic medical supplies, and—" She paused, her fingers confirming what she thought she had felt. "His backup pistol." The revelation that they weren't completely defenseless changed the dynamic of their situation dramatically. Margaret felt around until she found Mary's bag, then carefully extracted the items her sister had described. "We need light to see what we're dealing with," she decided, "but we have to be careful. Any light will be visible from a long distance in these tunnels." Elizabeth had been exploring their chamber by touch and made an important discovery. "There's another passage on the far side of this room," she reported. "It feels like it slopes upward. If we're lucky, it might lead to another entrance." The decision to risk lighting the small lantern was not made lightly, but they needed to understand their environment if they were going to survive. Margaret struck a match, and the sudden flare of light revealed their surroundings in stark detail. The chamber was larger than they had imagined, with multiple passages leading off in different directions. Old mining equipment lay scattered about, the picks, shovels, and lengths of rope that might prove useful. Most importantly, the upward-sloping passage Elizabeth had found showed signs of air circulation, suggesting it did indeed lead toward the surface. But it was what Catherine spotted, in the brief moment before Margaret extinguished the match, that would prove most significant to their survival. "There," she whispered urgently, "on that timber beam. Did you see it?" Margaret struck another match and held it toward the support beam Catherine indicated. Carved into the wood, barely visible after years in the damp mine air, were initials and a date, W.H. 1871. William Henderson, Mary breathed. Papa was here. The realization that their father had been in this very mine shaft 15 years earlier seemed impossible, but the evidence was undeniable. Marshal Henderson had been a young man in 1871, probably working as a deputy or pursuing outlaws through these same tunnels. He must have been chasing someone through here, Elizabeth reasoned, or maybe hiding just like we are. Sarah, despite her fear, managed a small smile. Papa always said the best hiding places are the ones other people have already used successfully. Margaret extinguished the match to preserve their limited supply, but the knowledge that their father had once faced similar dangers in this same location gave them all a measure of comfort. If Marshal Henderson had survived whatever brought him to this mine shaft, perhaps his daughters could do the same. We wait until full dark, Margaret decided. Then we try the upward passage. If those killers are still searching, they'll be using lanterns that will give away their positions. In complete darkness, we have the advantage. The hours that followed tested their courage and endurance in ways none of them had imagined. They took turns sleeping while others kept watch, sharing the hard biscuits Mary had salvaged and rationing their water carefully. The darkness was so complete that they lost all sense of time, measuring the passage of hours only by their growing hunger and the distant sounds that occasionally echoed through the mine shafts. Twice they heard the bandits searching other passages, their voices and lantern light a reminder of the deadly threat that still hunted them. But the killers seemed to be growing frustrated with the maze-like tunnels, and their searches became less thorough as time passed. "They're giving up," Catherine whispered during one of these episodes. "They can't afford to stay much longer if there really is a posse looking for them." But Margaret wasn't ready to assume they were safe. The leader's recognition of their father's name and his talk of settling old scores suggested a level of personal motivation that might override practical concerns about escape. As what they estimated to be evening approached, based on their own fatigue and hunger, Margaret made the decision to attempt their escape through the upward passage. They would move in complete darkness, feeling their way toward what they hoped would be freedom, or at least a better defensive position. "Remember," she told her sisters as they prepared to leave their temporary sanctuary, "we stay together, no matter what. If we get separated in these tunnels, we might never find each other again." The 5 Henderson sisters began their careful ascent through the narrow passage, each step taking them either closer to safety or deeper into a trap that could claim all their lives. Behind them, the chamber where their father had once carved his initials stood empty, while somewhere in the darkness above, their fate waited to be determined. The upward passage proved to be more challenging than any of the Henderson sisters had anticipated. What had appeared to be a gradual slope in the brief glimpse of lantern light revealed itself to be a treacherous climb through loose rock and rotting timber supports. The air grew thinner as they ascended, and more than once falling debris from their passage echoed through the tunnels below, causing them all to freeze in terror that the sound might attract their pursuers. Margaret led the way, her hands bleeding from scrapes against sharp stone as she felt for handholds in the darkness. Behind her, Elizabeth's practical dress had torn in several places, but she continued climbing without complaint. Catherine's auburn hair had come completely loose from its pins, and she constantly had to push it out of her face as she navigated the treacherous ascent. Mary, despite carrying the bag with their father's emergency supplies, proved surprisingly agile in the confined space. Her quiet nature seemed to serve her well in the darkness, as she moved with careful precision that avoided most of the loose rocks that plagued her sisters. Sarah, the youngest, struggled the most with the physical demands of the climb, but Her determination to reach safety drove her forward. After what felt like hours of climbing, Margaret's outstretched hand encountered something that made her heart race with hope. "There's an opening ahead," she whispered back to her sisters. "I can feel air moving." The opening led to another chamber, but this one was different from the worked mining areas below. The air was fresher, carrying scents of pine and sage that suggested proximity to the surface. More importantly, faint starlight filtered down from somewhere above, providing the first natural light they had seen since entering the mine. "Look," Elizabeth said softly, pointing toward the source of the light. "There's a shaft going straight up. It might be a ventilation opening." The vertical shaft was too narrow and too high to offer escape, but the starlight it provided allowed them to examine their surroundings properly for the first time. The chamber they had reached was clearly much older than the mining operations. Below, the walls showed signs of natural formation rather than systematic excavation, and strange markings covered several of the stone surfaces. Catherine moved closer to examine the markings, her teacher's instincts taking over despite their desperate situation. "These aren't mining marks," she said with growing excitement. "They're older, much older." Mary joined her sister in studying the wall markings, and her sharp eyes caught something that made her gasp. "Margaret, bring the lantern over here. I think I see something." Margaret carefully lit the small lantern, shielding its glow as much as possible, while still providing enough light to examine what Mary had discovered. Carved into the stone wall, much more elaborate than the simple initials they had found below, was a detailed message in their father's familiar handwriting. "August 15th, 1871, Margaret read aloud in a whisper. "Cornered here by the Dalton gang. Jake Morrison wounded. If we don't make it out, tell my Clara that her brother died doing his duty. The stolen silver from the Silverton Bank is hidden behind the false wall in the third chamber down. May God protect anyone who finds this message. Deputy William Henderson, Colorado Territory." The sisters stared at the message in stunned silence. Not only had their father been in this exact spot 15 years earlier, but he had been pursuing the same kind of criminals who now hunted them. The mention of stolen silver and a hidden cache added another layer of complexity to their situation. "Jake Morrison," Elizabeth said thoughtfully. "Wasn't that the name of the deputy who testified at Papa's funeral about his bravery in Dodge City?" Sarah nodded, her memory sharper than her sisters expected. "He said Papa saved his life during a bank robbery when they were both young deputies." He must have been talking about this incident. The realization that their current desperate situation echoed their father's own experiences gave them both comfort and determination. Marshal Henderson had survived this encounter and gone on to a distinguished career in law enforcement. Perhaps his daughters could follow his example, but it was Mary who made the connection that would prove most significant. If Papa was chasing the Dalton gang, and they were carrying stolen silver, she said slowly, then this mine might be more important than we realized. Criminals have been using these tunnels for 15 years. Catherine's sharp intelligence grasped the implications immediately, which means the men hunting us might know about this place. They might even be connected to the original gang Papa was chasing. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground air. The bandit leaders' recognition of their father's name suddenly took on new significance. This wasn't just a random robbery. It was part of a longer story of criminal activity. In these mountains, we need to understand what we're dealing with, she decided. Mary, in Papa's emergency kit, did you see any of his old case notes or papers? Mary searched through the bag carefully, her fingers identifying items by touch. There's something here wrapped in oilcloth, she reported. It feels like papers. Margaret held the lantern, while Mary unwrapped a small bundle of documents that their father had apparently kept with his emergency supplies. The papers were yellowed with age, but still legible, and they told a story that explained much about their current predicament. The documents revealed that the Dalton gang had been operating throughout Colorado Territory for years, using a network of caves and abandoned mines to hide stolen goods and plan new robberies. Deputy Henderson's pursuit of them in 1871 had been part of a larger territorial effort to break up their operations. But the gang had never been completely eliminated. According to the notes, several members had escaped the law and continued operating under different names. The stolen silver mentioned in the wall message had never been recovered, suggesting it might still be hidden somewhere in the mine complex. "Look at this," Elizabeth said, examining one of the documents more closely. Papa wrote that the gang leader in 1871 was a man named Blackjack Dalton. He was never caught. Catherine's face went pale in the lantern light. "The man who robbed our stagecoach. He recognized Papa's name immediately. What if he's the same person?" The possibility that they were being hunted by the same criminal their father had pursued 15 years earlier added a personal dimension to their danger that none of them had anticipated. This wasn't just about robbery or random violence. It was about revenge. "If that's true," Margaret said grimly, "then he won't give up easily. He's been waiting 15 years to settle scores with the Henderson family." Sarah, despite her youth, grasped the tactical implications. "But it also means we might have advantages he doesn't know about. If Papa left information about these tunnels, we might know things about this place that even the criminals don't know." Mary had continued examining their father's papers and made another significant discovery. "There's a map here," she announced. "It shows the mine layout as Papa knew it in 1871, including passages that might not be on any official mining company records." The hand-drawn map revealed that the mine complex was far more extensive than they had realized. Their father had marked several chambers, multiple entrance points, and what appeared to be natural caves that connected to the man-made tunnels. Most intriguingly, he had marked one chamber with a star and the notation "Emergency Exit Cliff Face." "If we can find this emergency exit," Margaret said, studying the map, "we might be able to get out without going back through the main entrance, where they might be waiting." But Elizabeth, ever practical, pointed out the obvious problem. This map is 15 years old. Cave-ins, new mining activity, changes in the water table, any number of things could have altered the passages since Papa drew this. Catherine, however, was studying another aspect of the map that intrigued her. "Look at the way he's marked. The chambers where the stolen silver was supposed to be hidden. If that treasure is still here, it might be worth a fortune today." The temptation to search for the hidden silver was strong, but Margaret recognized it as a potentially fatal distraction. "Our priority has to be getting out alive," she decided. "If we survive this, we can worry about treasure later." A distant sound from the tunnels below cut short their discussion. Voices echoing through the mine shafts, still searching, still hunting. The bandits hadn't given up, and their persistence suggested that Catherine's suspicion might be correct. This was personal for their leader. "They're still down there," Mary whispered, extinguishing the lantern immediately. In the darkness that followed, the 5 Henderson sisters huddled together around their father's map and papers, trying to decide which passage to attempt next. The emergency exit marked on the 15-year-old map offered their best hope of escape, but reaching it would require navigating through parts of the mine complex they had never seen. As they prepared for the next phase of their underground odyssey, Margaret found herself thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought them to this place. They had come to Colorado seeking a new life with their aunt, only to be robbed by criminals who had known their father decades before any of them were born. Now they were following in Marshal Henderson's footsteps through the same dangerous tunnels where he had once faced similar deadly pursuit. The question was whether his daughters had inherited enough of his courage and cunning to survive where lesser people might perish. "Papa got out of here alive," Sarah said softly, as if reading Margaret's thoughts. He went on to marry Mama, have 5 daughters, and serve the law for 15 more years. We can get out too. Margaret squeezed her youngest sister's hand in the darkness. We will get out, she promised. And when we do, we're going to make sure those killers pay for what they did to Mrs. Blackwood and anyone else they've hurt. The Henderson sisters gathered their meager supplies and prepared to venture deeper into the maze of tunnels, following their father's ancient map toward an exit that might no longer exist. Pursued by enemies who had been waiting 15 years for revenge, the emergency exit marked on their father's 15-year-old map proved to be both a blessing and a curse. Following the ancient passages deeper into the mountain, the Henderson sisters discovered that Marshal Henderson's knowledge of the mine complex had been remarkably thorough. Every turn, every chamber, every branching tunnel matched his careful notations with startling accuracy. But the exit itself presented a challenge none of them had anticipated. "Dear God," Elizabeth whispered as they emerged from the final tunnel onto a narrow ledge carved into the sheer cliff face. Papa's emergency exit leads straight down a 100-foot drop. The ledge was barely 3 feet wide, with only some iron spikes driven into the rock face to suggest how someone might attempt the treacherous descent to the valley floor below. 15 years of weather had rusted the metal and loosened several of the anchor points, making the route look impossibly dangerous. Margaret peered over the edge in the pre-dawn darkness, her stomach lurching at the sight of the rocky chasm below. There must have been rope or climbing equipment here originally, she reasoned. Papa wouldn't have marked this as an exit unless there was a way to get down safely. Catherine, whose schoolteacher background had included lessons in practical problem-solving, examined the iron spikes more carefully. "These are positioned like anchor points for a rope system," she observed, "but any rope would have rotted away years ago." Mary, still carrying their father's emergency bag, had been quietly inventorying their limited resources. "We have about 30 feet of rope from the mining equipment we found," she reported, "but that's not nearly enough to reach the bottom." The sound of distant voices echoing from the tunnels behind them reminded them that staying on the ledge wasn't an option. Their pursuers were still searching the mine complex, and it was only a matter of time before someone discovered the passage that led to their current position. "There," Sarah said suddenly, pointing along the cliff face to their right. "Do you see that? It looks like another ledge about 20 feet down." Following her gaze, the sisters could make out a wider shelf of rock that appeared to offer more secure footing. More importantly, it seemed to connect to a natural path that zigzagged down the cliff face, treacherous but potentially passable. "If we can get to that ledge," Margaret said, thinking aloud, "we might be able to work our way down without needing more rope." Elizabeth, ever practical, raised the obvious concern. "And if we fall trying to reach it, we'll be just as dead as if we stayed here and let those killers find us." The debate was settled by the sound of bootsteps in the tunnel behind them. Someone had found their trail and was approaching the cliff face exit. Margaret made the decision that would either save their lives or end them. "We climb down," she said firmly. "Mary, tie one end of the rope around that anchor spike. The rest of us will lower ourselves to the ledge below." The descent was a nightmare of loose rock, rusted metal, and sheer terror. Margaret went first, her hands burning as she controlled her slide down the rope while trying to find footing on the treacherous cliff face. Elizabeth followed, her practical dress proving an advantage as it didn't catch on the rocky protrusions that snagged her sister's more elaborate clothing. Catherine's descent nearly ended in disaster when her weight pulled loose one of the iron spikes, sending a shower of rock fragments into the darkness below. Only her quick reflexes and Mary's steady handling of the rope kept her from falling to her death. Mary's turn came next, and she faced the additional challenge of lowering their father's emergency bag without losing the precious supplies it contained. Her quiet determination served her well as she descended with methodical precision, testing each handhold before trusting her weight to it. Sarah, the youngest and lightest, should have had the easiest descent, but her fear of heights made every foot of the climb an ordeal. By the time she reached the lower ledge, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the rope. They had barely gathered themselves on the narrow shelf when a lantern light appeared at the tunnel exit above them. One of their pursuers had found the passage to the cliff face. They went over the edge, a voice called back into the tunnel. Crazy fools probably killed themselves trying to get away. Margaret pressed herself against the cliff face, praying that the darkness would conceal their position on the ledge below. The bandits' lantern light swept back and forth, searching for signs of their presence. But the angle was wrong for him. To see their hiding place. "Boss ain't gonna like this," another voice replied from deeper in the tunnel. He wanted them taken alive so he could settle his score proper. Well, they're settling it now with the rocks at the bottom of this cliff. "Come on, let's get back and tell him we found their bodies." The voices retreated, but Margaret knew better than to trust their apparent safety. "They'll be back," she whispered to her sisters. "As soon as their leader realizes we might have survived, he'll send someone down to check for bodies." The natural path down the cliff face proved to be an ancient game trail, probably used by deer and elk to reach water sources in the valley below. It was narrow and treacherous, with loose stones that threatened to send them tumbling into the abyss, but it was passable. As the first light of dawn began to illuminate the eastern peaks, the Henderson sisters finally reached the valley floor. They were exhausted, bleeding from numerous cuts and scrapes, and their clothing was torn beyond repair. But they were alive and free of the mine complex that had nearly become their tomb. But their ordeal was far from over. The valley they found themselves in was narrow and remote, with steep sides that offered limited routes to safety. More concerning, the only visible path led directly toward a thin column of smoke rising from what appeared to be a cabin or camp hidden among the trees. "Could be trappers or prospectors," Elizabeth said hopefully. "Someone who might help us." Catherine, whose sharp eyes had caught details her sisters missed, shook her head grimly. "Look at the horses picketed near those trees. Those are the same animals the bandits were riding during the robbery." The realization that they had descended directly into their enemy's camp sent a wave of despair through the exhausted sisters. After hours of desperate flight through underground passages and down a treacherous cliff face, they had delivered themselves to the very people who wanted them dead. "There's nowhere to run," Sarah said, her voice breaking with exhaustion and fear. "We're trapped." But Mary, the quietest sister, had been studying their surroundings with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. "Not trapped," she said softly. "Look." Following her gaze, the sisters saw something that made their hearts race with renewed hope. Riding slowly through the morning mist at the far end of the valley came a group of mounted men, their badges catching the early sunlight like silver stars. "Lawman," Margaret breathed. "A real posse." The lead rider was a tall man in a dark coat, his bearing suggesting authority and experience. Even at a distance, there was something familiar about his posture and the way he sat his horse that reminded Margaret of someone she had known. As the posse drew closer, Catherine suddenly gasped. "I know him. That's Jake Morrison, the deputy who spoke at Papa's funeral. The man who had been wounded alongside their father in this very valley 15 years earlier had returned, now wearing the badge of a U.S. Marshal. His presence here couldn't be coincidence. He must have been tracking the same criminals who had robbed their stagecoach, but the Henderson sisters' moment of hope turned to terror as they realized their position. They were caught between the bandit camp ahead and the approaching lawmen behind, with no cover and no way to signal their identity without alerting their enemies to the posse's presence. From the cabin ahead came the sound of harsh voices and the jingle of spurs as the bandits prepared to mount up. They had spotted the approaching lawman and were preparing for a fight that would leave the sisters trapped in the crossfire. Margaret made a desperate decision. Pulling her father's pistol from Mary's bag, she checked to ensure it was loaded, then looked at each of her sisters in turn. "When the shooting starts," she said quietly, "we run for those rocks on the left. Stay low, stay together, and pray that Marshal Morrison recognizes us before he decides we're with the wrong side." The bandit leader's voice carried clearly across the valley as he called to his men. "It's that fool Morrison again, boys. Same. Deputy who's been dogging our trail for months. Time to finish what we started with his partner 15 years ago." Marshal Morrison, still unaware of the sisters' presence, raised his hand to signal his posse to spread out for an attack on the bandit camp. His weathered face showed the grim determination of a man who had been pursuing these criminals across half of Colorado territory. What he didn't know was that the daughters of his old partner, William Henderson, were about to be caught in the middle of a gunfight that would determine whether justice or revenge would win the day in this remote mountain valley. The sun crested the eastern peaks, flooding the valley with golden light that would illuminate either a rescue or a massacre. The Henderson sisters crouched behind their meager cover, listening to the sound of weapons being readied on both sides, and wondered if they had survived the night underground only to die in the crossfire of their father's unfinished business. The first gunshot shattered the morning stillness like thunder, followed immediately by the sharp crack of return fire from the bandit camp. Marshal Jake Morrison's posse had spread out in a practiced formation, using the natural cover of boulders and trees to advance on their quarry, while the outlaws had taken defensive positions around their cabin and horse corral. The Henderson sisters pressed themselves against the rocky outcropping Margaret had chosen for their meager shelter, acutely aware that they were exposed to crossfire from both sides. The sound of bullets whistling overhead and striking stone around them made it clear that their position was far from safe. "We have to let Marshal Morrison know who we are," Elizabeth shouted over the gunfire. "He thinks we're part of the gang." Margaret, clutching their father's pistol with white knuckles, shook her head. "If we show ourselves now, we'll be shot by one side or the other. We have to wait for a lull in the fighting." But Catherine had been watching the battle with the analytical mind that had made her an effective teacher, and she had noticed something that changed their tactical situation completely. "Look at how the bandits are positioned," she called to her sisters. "They're not trying to escape. They're making a stand here because they think this valley is defensible." Mary, despite the terror of their situation, understood what Catherine was suggesting. "They don't know about the mine entrance. They think the only way out is past the posse." The realization gave Margaret an idea that was either brilliant or suicidal. "If we can get back to the mine entrance without being seen, we might be able to circle around behind the bandits. Marshal Morrison's men are all focused on the cabin area. They won't expect an attack from the rear." Sarah, the youngest sister, stared at Margaret in disbelief. "You want us to go back into that horrible place?" "I want us to survive," Margaret replied grimly. "And right now, the mine tunnels might be our safest option." The opportunity came when one of Morrison's deputies made a flanking move that drew concentrated fire from the bandit positions. Using the distraction, the five sisters ran in a crouch toward the mine entrance they had spent the night trying to escape from. The irony of seeking safety in the place that had nearly become their tomb was not lost on any of them. But as they reached the familiar darkness of the tunnel mouth, Mary made a discovery that changed everything. Scattered on the ground near the entrance were items that hadn't been there during their earlier escape: a torn piece of fabric, some spent cartridge cases, and most significantly, a leather pouch that she recognized immediately. "This is Mrs. Blackwood's," she said, holding up the pouch. "The widow from the Stagecoach?" Elizabeth examined the torn fabric and felt her heart sink. "She's dead, isn't she? They killed her after we ran." But Catherine, whose sharp eyes missed nothing, pointed to something else among the scattered items. Look at the blood on these rocks. It's not all in one place. It's scattered, like someone was moving around, maybe fighting back. The evidence suggested that Mrs. Blackwood had not died easily, and that her sacrifice had been even greater than they had imagined. But it was what Mary found inside the leather pouch that provided them with the weapon they would need to end this confrontation once and for all. "Papers," she announced, pulling out a bundle of documents that Mrs. Blackwood had somehow managed to protect during her final struggle. Legal papers and, oh my God! Margaret took the documents and quickly scanned their contents by the dim light filtering into the mine entrance. What she found made her understand why Mrs. Blackwood had been on that stagecoach, and why the bandits had been so interested in robbing it specifically. She was a federal agent, Margaret breathed. Mrs. Blackwood was working for the U.S. Marshal's office, investigating the same gang that killed Papa's friend 15 years ago. The papers revealed that the woman they had known as a bitter widow was actually Deputy U.S. Marshal Rebecca Blackwood, working undercover to infiltrate the criminal network that had been operating throughout Colorado Territory for decades. Her presence on their stagecoach had not been coincidence. She had been tracking the same outlaws who had recognized their father's name. More importantly, her documents contained detailed information about the gang's operations, including the location of their main hideout, the names of their confederates in various towns, and most crucially, evidence that several local officials had been taking bribes to protect the criminals. "This is why they killed her," Elizabeth said, understanding the implications. She had enough evidence to destroy their entire organization. But it was the final document in Mrs. Blackwood's collection that provided the Henderson sisters with the key to their survival. It was a wanted poster, 15 years old but still legally valid, offering a substantial reward for the capture of Black Jack Dalton and associates for multiple counts of robbery, murder, and assault on federal officers. The poster included detailed descriptions of the gang members, and Margaret felt her blood run cold as she recognized the leader who had robbed their stagecoach. Mrs. Blackwood had been right. He was the same man their father had pursued through these very tunnels in 1871. "We have to get these papers to Marshal Morrison," Margaret said, understanding that they now held the evidence needed to convict their tormentors. "This proves everything, who they are, what they've done, and why they wanted revenge on Papa's family." The gunfight outside had intensified, with the sound of splintering wood suggesting that Morrison's men were closing in on the cabin. But the sisters could also hear the bandit leader shouting orders that made it clear he wasn't planning to surrender. "Burn it down," came his harsh voice across the valley. "If we can't hold it, nobody gets it." Catherine peered out of the mine entrance and saw smoke beginning to rise from the cabin area. "They're destroying evidence," she realized. "All the proof of their crimes is going up in flames." Mary, still examining Mrs. Blackwood's papers, made another crucial discovery. "There's a map here showing where they've hidden stolen goods from dozens of robberies, including the silver Papa was chasing 15 years ago." The map marked several cache locations throughout the mountain region, but one location was circled in red, with a notation that made Margaret's heart race. "Primary. Cache. Abandoned mine shaft, Eagle Valley. Recovery key. Hidden behind false wall, third chamber." "That's here," she breathed. "The silver Papa was chasing is still hidden somewhere in these tunnels." Elizabeth, ever practical, pointed out the obvious. "We can worry about treasure later. Right now we need to stay alive long enough to see those killers brought to justice." But Sarah, despite her youth and fear, had grasped something her older sisters had missed. "Don't you see? If we can find that silver, we have physical proof of their crimes. Even if they burn all the evidence at their camp, we'll still have something to show Marshal Morrison." The sound of approaching footsteps in the tunnel behind them cut short their discussion. Someone was coming through the mine complex, moving with the confidence of someone familiar with the passages. Margaret raised their father's pistol, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Get behind me," she whispered, to her sisters. "If it's one of them, I'll try to give you time to run." But the figure that emerged from the tunnel darkness was not one of their pursuers. It was Marshal Jake Morrison himself, his weathered face showing the strain of years spent tracking criminals through some of the most dangerous country in the American West. "Don't shoot, ladies," he said calmly, his hands visible and empty. "I'm here to help." Margaret kept the pistol trained on him, not ready to trust anyone after the betrayals and violence of the past day. "How do we know you're really a marshal? How did you find us?" Morrison slowly reached into his coat and produced his badge, the silver star catching what little light filtered into the mine entrance. But it was what he said next that convinced Margaret to lower her weapon. "Because 15 years ago, your father saved my life in these same tunnels, Miss Henderson, and I've been looking for Blackjack Dalton ever since, waiting for the chance to finish what William Henderson started." He had recognized them, despite their bedraggled condition and torn clothing. More than that, he had come alone into the dangerous mine complex to find them, leaving his deputies to continue the gun battle outside. "Marshal Morrison," Margaret said, lowering the pistol with relief, "we have something you need to see." She handed him Mrs. Blackwood's papers, watching. His face changed as he realized the significance of what they contained. When he looked up from the documents, his expression carried the grim satisfaction of a man who had finally found the evidence he needed to close a case that had haunted him for 15 years. "Rebecca Blackwood was the finest deputy I ever worked with," he said quietly. "She died trying to bring these animals to justice. Now we're going to finish her work." The sound of the gun battle outside was diminishing, suggesting that one side or the other was gaining the upper hand. But Morrison's attention was focused on the sisters and the evidence they had preserved. "Ladies, you've done something remarkable. Here, these documents will put Dalton and his gang away for life, assuming we can take them alive." He paused, his weathered face showing concern. "The question is, are you willing to help me do it?" Marshal Morrison's request that the Henderson sisters help him capture Blackjack Dalton was met with immediate and unanimous agreement. After everything they had endured, the robbery, Mrs. Blackwood's murder, the terrifying night in the mine tunnels, and the dangerous cliff descent, the thought of letting their father's killers escape was unthinkable. "What do you need us to do?" Margaret asked, her voice carrying the same determination that had carried her family through their darkest hours. Morrison studied the map Mrs. Blackwood had preserved, his experienced eyes analyzing the tactical situation. "According to this, the main cache of stolen silver is hidden in the third chamber down from where we found your father's message. If we can secure that evidence while my deputies keep Dalton's men pinned down outside, we'll have enough proof to convict the entire organization." Elizabeth, ever practical, raised the obvious concern. "But how do we get to the third chamber without running into more of their men? They know these tunnels better than we do." Morrison's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. "Actually, miss, I don't think they do. Dalton's been avoiding this area for 15 years because of what happened with your father. His men probably know the basic layout, but they won't know about the passages your father mapped or the changes that have occurred since the mining company abandoned this place." Mary, still clutching their father's emergency supplies, had been studying the old map by the dim light filtering into the mine entrance. "There's something else," she said quietly. "According to Papa's notes, the third chamber has 2 entrances. If some of us go one way and some go the other, we could surround anyone who might be guarding the cache." Catherine, whose teaching experience had made her skilled at organizing complex activities, began working out the logistics. "Marshal Morrison, how many men do you have outside?" 6 deputies, all experienced in this kind of work," he replied. "They can keep Dalton's gang busy for as long as we need. But we can't take forever. These outlaws are desperate, and desperate men do unpredictable things." As if to emphasize his point, the sound of gunfire from outside intensified, followed by shouting that suggested the battle was reaching a critical phase. Through the mine entrance, they could see more smoke rising from the valley, indicating that the destruction of evidence was continuing. "We need to move now," Morrison decided. "Miss Margaret, can you and one of your sisters guide me to the third chamber using your father's map? The rest of you should stay here where it's safe." But Sarah, the youngest Henderson sister, surprised everyone by speaking up with unexpected firmness. "No, Marshal, we all go together, or none of us go. We've stayed together through everything. Elton, we're not splitting up now." Morrison looked as though he might argue, but something in the young woman's voice reminded him of her father's stubborn dedication to justice. "All right, ladies. But you follow my lead. You do exactly what I say, and if shooting starts, you get down and stay down." The journey through the mine complex to reach the third chamber was both familiar and strange. The sisters had traveled some of these passages during their desperate flight, but approaching them with purpose rather than panic made everything look different. Morrison moved with the confident efficiency of a man who had spent years tracking criminals through dangerous territory, his presence lending them courage they hadn't known they possessed. When they reached the chamber where their father had carved his message 15 years earlier, Morrison paused to read the wall inscription by the light of his lantern. "William Henderson was the finest lawman I ever knew," he said quietly. "He saved my life, taught me how to think like a criminal in order to catch them, and died doing his duty. If we can finish what he started here, his death will have meant something." The words brought tears to Margaret's eyes, but also strengthened her resolve. They weren't just seeking justice for themselves or even for Mrs. Blackwood. They were completing a mission their father had begun when they were children. The third chamber, when they finally located it, proved to be larger and more complex than their father's map had indicated. Years of water seepage had created new passages, while partial cave-ins had blocked others. But the false wall mentioned in Marshal Henderson's notes was exactly where he had marked it, hidden behind a carefully constructed facade that looked like natural rock formation. "There," Mary whispered, pointing to what appeared to be a solid stone wall. "Those rocks don't match the others. They're newer, placed deliberately." Morrison examined the false wall carefully, his experienced hands finding the concealed mechanism that would reveal what lay behind it. "Your father was right," he said with admiration. "This is masterful work. If you didn't know it was here, you'd never find it." Working together, they managed to shift the carefully balanced stones that concealed the cache entrance. What they found behind the false wall took their breath away. The hidden chamber contained more than just the silver stolen from the Silverton Bank 15 years earlier. Years of criminal activity had turned it into a treasure trove of stolen goods from dozens of robberies throughout Colorado territory. Gold coins, silver bars, jewelry, and even stacks of paper money filled wooden crates and leather sacks that represented fortunes stolen from honest citizens. "Dear Lord," Elizabeth breathed, "this must be worth tens of thousands of dollars." Morrison was examining some of the paper documents stored with the treasure, records of robberies, lists of victims, and, most importantly, detailed accounts of bribes paid to corrupt officials who had protected the gang's operations. "This is better than we hoped," he said with satisfaction. "These records will expose the entire network of corruption that's allowed Dalton's gang to operate for so long. Judges, sheriffs, even some territorial officials, they're all named here." But Catherine had noticed something that chilled her blood. Among the newer additions to the cache were items she recognized from recent robberies, including a distinctive pocket watch that had belonged to the traveling salesman who had shared their stagecoach. "Jeremiah Walsh," she said softly, holding Up the watch. They killed him too, didn't they? Morrison's face darkened as he examined the watch and several other items that clearly came from recent victims. Dalton's been using this cash for years, adding to it with every robbery. Some of these items, he paused, his voice heavy with grief, some of these belonged to lawmen who tried to stop them. The full scope of Blackjack Dalton's criminal enterprise was becoming clear. This wasn't just about the bank robbery that had brought Marshal Henderson to these tunnels in 1871. It was about decades of murder, theft, and corruption that had turned parts of Colorado Territory into a lawless wasteland where honest citizens lived in fear. "We have to get this evidence to your deputies," Margaret said, understanding that they now held the key to destroying an entire criminal organization. "But how do we transport all of this without being caught?" Morrison had been thinking the same thing, and his solution was both simple and dangerous. "We don't transport it, we bring the law to it." He pulled out a signal whistle from his coat. "This will bring my deputies running, but it will also alert Dalton's men to our location. Once I blow this whistle, we'll have maybe 5 minutes before this chamber becomes a battleground." Mary, whose quiet observation had served them well throughout their ordeal, pointed out a crucial detail they had all missed. "Look at the entrance. We came through. It's the only way into this chamber since the cave-in blocked the other passage Papa marked on his map. If anyone comes after us, they'll have to come single file through that narrow opening." Elizabeth grasped the tactical implications immediately. "We could defend this position. With all this treasure as evidence and only one way in, we could hold them off until help arrives." Sarah, despite her youth and the terror she had experienced, showed the same courage that had carried her family through their darkest hours. "Then let's do it. Let's finish what Papa started." Morrison looked at each of the Henderson sisters, in turn seeing in their faces the same determination that had made their father a legend among frontier lawmen. "Ladies, what we're about to do is extremely dangerous. Once I signal my deputies, Blackjack Dalton will know we've found his treasure. And cash. He'll throw everything he has at us to prevent this evidence from reaching the territorial courts." Margaret checked their father's pistol, ensuring it was fully loaded, while her sisters armed themselves with mining tools from the chamber, picks, hammers, and anything else that could serve as weapons. "Marshal Morrison, Dalton killed our father's partner, murdered Mrs. Blackwood, and tried to kill us. We're not backing down now." Morrison nodded with respect and raised the signal whistle to his lips. "Then God help us all, because we're about to face the fight of our lives." The sharp blast of the whistle echoed through the mine tunnels like a clarion call to battle, carrying with it the promise that 15 years of injustice were about to come to an end in the depths of an abandoned Colorado mineshaft. The echo of Marshal Morrison's whistle had barely faded when the sound of running footsteps filled the mine tunnels. But these weren't the measured steps of approaching lawmen. They were the desperate, angry sounds of criminals who realized their entire operation had been exposed. "They found it!" Blackjack Dalton's voice roared through the passages, distorted by the stone walls, but unmistakably furious. 15 years I've been building that cache, and Henderson's brats just handed it all to the law." Margaret positioned herself behind one of the wooden treasure crates, her father's pistol steady in her hands, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Beside her, Elizabeth gripped a mining pick with grim determination, while Catherine held a heavy hammer that could crush a skull with one well-placed blow. Mary had found a defensive position that allowed her to watch the narrow entrance while still protecting Sarah, who clutched a sharp-pointed rock chisel like a dagger. Despite her youth and the terror of their situation, the youngest Henderson sister's eyes blazed with the same fierce determination that had carried her family through their ordeal. Marshal Morrison crouched behind the largest stack of silver. Bars, his rifle trained on the tunnel entrance. "Remember, He called quietly to the sisters. They have to come through that opening one at a time. We have the advantage if we keep our heads and work together. The first indication of their enemies' approach came not from sound, but from the dancing shadows cast by flickering torchlight on the tunnel walls. Blackjack Dalton was bringing fire as well as guns, probably planning to smoke them out if direct assault failed. "Henderson!" Dalton's voice echoed from the passage. "I know you can hear me. Your daddy cost me 15 years of looking over my shoulder, wondering when the law would catch up. Now I'm gonna settle that debt with his daughters." Margaret felt rage building in her chest at the casual way this killer spoke about their father, but she forced herself to remain calm. Emotion would get them killed in the next few minutes. "Your quarrel was with Marshal Henderson," Morrison called back. "These women never did you any harm." Dalton's laughter was harsh and cruel. "They found my cash, didn't they? They're gonna testify against me in court, ain't they? That makes them fair game in my book." The first assault came without warning. A burning torch sailed through the entrance, followed immediately by two of Dalton's men, who burst into the chamber with guns blazing. Morrison's rifle cracked once, twice, and both attackers went down, but not before their wild shots had ricocheted off the stone walls, filling the air with deadly fragments. "Stay down," Morrison shouted, but the Henderson sisters were already moving with the coordinated precision of people who had learned to trust each other completely. Elizabeth circled to the left side of the entrance, her mining pick ready to strike anyone who tried to flank their position. Catherine moved right, positioning herself where she could defend the treasure records that represented the evidence needed to convict the entire criminal organization. A second wave of attackers followed immediately, but these men were more cautious, using the cover of gunsmoke and flickering torchlight to advance into the chamber. One of them made the mistake of assuming that Mary, the quietest Henderson sister, would be the easiest target. He learned his error when her rock chisel found his throat with surgical precision. The battle that followed was brief, but savage. Black. Jack Dalton had brought 4 men into the tunnels, leaving the rest to hold off Morrison's deputies outside. In the confined space of the treasure chamber, superior numbers meant nothing, and the Henderson sisters' desperate courage proved more than a match for criminal desperation. Margaret's shooting, guided by her father's training, accounted for 2 of the attackers. Elizabeth's mining pick crushed the skull of a man who tried to destroy the evidence records. Catherine's hammer shattered the gun arm of another, leaving him screaming and helpless. But it was Sarah, the youngest and supposedly weakest of the sisters, who ended the immediate threat. When one of Dalton's men grabbed Mary from behind, using her as a human shield, while he aimed at Morrison, Sarah didn't hesitate. Her rock chisel, thrown with desperate accuracy, caught the man in the eye and dropped him instantly. In the sudden silence that followed, the 5 Henderson sisters and Marshal Morrison found themselves standing among the bodies of their enemies, their clothes stained with blood and gun smoke, but alive and victorious. "Is that all of them?" Elizabeth asked, her voice surprisingly steady considering what they had just experienced. Morrison was checking each fallen man to ensure they posed no further threat. "In here, yes, but Dalton himself wasn't among them. He sent his men to die while he—" The marshal's words were cut off by the sound of gunfire from the tunnels outside the chamber, but this wasn't the random shooting of a gun battle. These were measured, deliberate shots, followed by the sound of voices calling in the distinctive cadence of lawmen coordinating an arrest. "Boss!" came a desperate shout from somewhere in the mine complex. "The law's got us surrounded! They're in the tunnels!" Morrison's deputies had received his signal and entered the mine from multiple directions, using their superior numbers and knowledge of the layout to trap the remaining criminals in a deadly maze of stone passages. But Blackjack Dalton wasn't finished. "Henderson girls," his voice echoed through the chamber, coming from a direction none of them had expected. "I got something that belongs to you." Margaret turned toward the sound and felt her blood run cold. Dalton had found another entrance to the chamber, probably through a passage that hadn't existed when her father mapped the area 15 years earlier. He stood in a narrow opening that must have been created by recent cave-ins, and in his arms he held an unconscious figure that made Margaret's heart stop. It was their Aunt Clara, the woman they had been traveling to meet in Silver Creek. Her grey hair was disheveled, her traveling dress torn and stained with blood, but she was alive. "Thought you'd like to see your dear auntie," Dalton said with malicious satisfaction. "Found her in Silver Creek, asking questions about 5 nieces who never showed up. Real worried about you girls, she was." Margaret felt the world tilting around her. Their aunt, the woman who represented their only hope for a new life, had been drawn into this nightmare because of them. "Let her go, Dalton," Morrison said quietly, his rifle trained on the outlaw leader. "Your quarrel is with me and the law, not with innocent women." Dalton's grin was visible even in the flickering light of the dying torches. "Innocent? These Henderson women destroyed 15 years of work, cost me a fortune in stolen goods, and got most of my men killed. I'd say that makes them far from innocent." He shifted his grip on Aunt Clara, revealing the knife he held at her throat. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to let me walk out of here with the old woman. In exchange, I'll let her live long enough to see what I do to her precious nieces." The threat was clear, but Margaret saw something in Dalton's eyes that told her he had no intention of honoring any bargain. This man had killed their fathers, in partner, murdered Mrs. Blackwood, and terrorized innocent people for decades. He would kill Aunt Clara regardless of what they did. "No deal," Margaret said firmly, raising her father's pistol. Dalton's eyes widened with surprise. He had expected fear, pleading, perhaps even surrender. He hadn't expected defiance from a woman whose family he had already destroyed once. "You're making a mistake, girl. I'll cut her throat right here in front of you." "And then Marshal Morrison will shoot you dead," Margaret replied calmly. "Either way, your reign of terror ends today." For a moment, the tableau held. Dalton with his hostage, Morrison with his rifle, and the Henderson sisters positioned around the chamber like the points of a star, each ready to act when the moment came. It was Aunt Clara herself who broke the stalemate. The older woman, who had seemed unconscious in Dalton's arms, suddenly twisted with surprising strength and drove her elbow into his ribs. The unexpected attack caused him to loosen his grip, just enough for her to break free and throw herself toward her nieces. Morrison's rifle boomed in the confined space, followed immediately by the crack of Margaret's pistol. Blackjack Dalton, the man who had terrorized Colorado Territory for decades and killed Marshal William Henderson's partner 15 years earlier, pitched backward into the narrow passage and lay still. The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Then Aunt Clara's voice, shaky but determined, broke through the ringing in their ears. "Margaret, Elizabeth, Catherine, Mary, Sarah. Dear God, I thought I'd lost you all." The reunion of the Henderson family, surrounded by treasure and bodies, in the depths of an abandoned mine, was not what any of them had imagined when they began their journey to Colorado Territory. But it was theirs, and they had earned it through courage, determination, and the unbreakable bonds of sisterhood that had carried them through their darkest hours. The courthouse in Denver was packed beyond capacity on the morning of the territorial. Hearing that would determine the fate of the surviving members of Blackjack Dalton's criminal organization. Word had spread throughout Colorado Territory about the 5 Henderson sisters who had survived a stagecoach robbery, spent a night hiding in an abandoned mineshaft, and helped bring down one of the most notorious outlaw gangs in the American West. Margaret Henderson sat in the front row of the witness section, her testimony having concluded the previous day. She wore a new blue dress that Aunt Clara had insisted on purchasing for the occasion, but her hands still bore the scars from their desperate escape down the cliff face 2 months earlier. Those scars had become a source of pride rather than shame. proof of what the Henderson family had endured and overcome. Elizabeth sat beside her, equally transformed from the practical sister who had focused on survival to a young woman who had discovered reserves of courage she had never known. She possessed. Her testimony about Mrs. Blackwood's heroic sacrifice had moved several jurors to tears and established beyond doubt that the widow had died in the line of duty as a federal agent. Catherine, whose sharp intelligence had served them well throughout. Their ordeal had become the family's unofficial historian, documenting their experiences in a detailed journal that would eventually be published as a book about frontier justice. Publishers in New York and Chicago had already expressed interest in her account of their survival story. Mary, still the quietest of the sisters, had surprised everyone by becoming the most effective witness against the surviving gang members. Her careful observation of details during their captivity had provided crucial evidence that corroborated Mrs. Blackwood's undercover reports. Sarah, the youngest Henderson sister, had grown visibly during their ordeal. The frightened girl who had whispered questions about their journey had been replaced by a confident young woman who faced down defense attorneys with the same determination she had shown when fighting for her family's lives in the mineshaft. Judge Augustus Hartley, a stern man with grey whiskers who had presided over territorial courts for 20 years, called the session to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. The courtroom fell silent as he surveyed the assembled crowd with eyes that had seen every form of frontier justice and injustice. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Hartley began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "we are here to conclude the territorial hearing regarding the criminal organization known as the Dalton Gang, and to determine appropriate sentences for the surviving defendants." At the defendants' table sat 3 men, the survivors of the gun battle at the mineshaft who had been captured by Marshal Morrison's deputies. Their faces showed the sullen defiance of career criminals who had finally been caught but remained unrepentant for their crimes. "Before we proceed to sentencing," Judge Hartley continued, "I want to address the extraordinary circumstances that brought this case before my court. The evidence presented over the past week has revealed a criminal conspiracy that extended far beyond simple robbery into murder, corruption of public officials, and terrorism of honest citizens throughout Colorado Territory." He paused to consult. The papers before him then looked directly at the Henderson sisters. The courage shown by these 5 young women in preserving crucial evidence and assisting federal marshals in apprehending dangerous criminals represents the finest tradition of frontier justice. Their actions have not only avenged the murder of their father's partner and fellow law enforcement officers, but have exposed a network of corruption that threatened the very foundations of law and order in our territory. Marshal Morrison, who had become something of a hero in the territorial press, stood when Judge Hartley called upon him for his final report. His weathered face showed the satisfaction of a man who had finally completed a mission that had haunted him for 15 years. "Your Honor," Morrison began, "the evidence recovered from the defendant's cache in the abandoned mine shaft has led to the arrest of corrupt officials in 4 different counties. Sheriff Baxter in Leadville, Judge Crawford in Cripple Creek, and Territorial Representative Mason have all been charged with accepting bribes to protect criminal activities." A murmur ran through the courtroom at the mention of such high-ranking officials. The corruption exposed by Mrs. Blackwood's investigation and the Henderson sisters' survival had reached far higher than anyone had initially suspected. Furthermore, Morrison continued, the treasure cache contained evidence linking the defendants to 17 murders, 43 robberies, and numerous assaults on federal officers. The total value of recovered stolen goods exceeds $50,000. The astronomical sum drew gasps from the gallery. $50,000 represented more money than most frontier families would see in several lifetimes. Judge Hartley nodded gravely. Marshal Morrison, in your professional opinion, what would have been the ultimate fate of this criminal organization had the Henderson sisters not preserved the evidence that led to these arrests? Morrison's answer was immediate and certain. Your Honor, they would have continued their reign of terror indefinitely. The corruption they had established among local officials made them virtually untouchable through conventional law enforcement. Only the extraordinary courage of these young women and the sacrifice of Deputy Marshal Blackwood made justice possible. When the judge called for victim impact statements, Aunt Clara Henderson rose with dignity that commanded attention throughout the courtroom. She had recovered from her ordeal as Dalton's hostage, but the experience had left her with a deeper understanding of both evil and heroism than she had possessed before. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. My brother William Henderson died, believing that law and order would eventually triumph over lawlessness. In the American West, his daughters had proven that his faith was justified. She turned to look at the defendants, her gaze unflinching. These men stole my brother's life, terrorized his daughters, and murdered innocent people for profit. But they failed to understand that the values William Henderson represented, courage, justice, and family loyalty, cannot be killed by bullets or intimidation. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Aunt Clara continued. The treasure they hoarded in that mineshaft will be returned to its rightful owners or used to compensate the families of their victims. But the true treasure, the strength and character my nieces showed in bringing these criminals to justice, that belongs to them forever. When Judge Hartley called for the defendants to make their final statements before sentencing, 2 of the 3 men remained silent. But the third, a scarred man named Charlie who had been with Dalton for over a decade, rose with obvious reluctance. Judge, he said in a voice barely above a whisper, I ain't gonna beg for mercy, 'cause I know I don't deserve it. But I want them Henderson girls to know that what they done in that mine, that took more guts than any of us ever had. His admission brought a moment of unexpected humanity to the proceedings, but it didn't change the fundamental facts of their crimes. Judge Hartley's sentences were swift and final. The 3 surviving gang members received terms of life imprisonment at the Territorial Penitentiary with no possibility of parole. The corrupt officials who had protected them received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years, effectively ending their political careers and serving as a warning to others who might consider similar corruption. But it was the judge's final statement that provided the most fitting conclusion to the entire ordeal. The case of the Henderson sisters, he declared, will stand as proof that justice in the American West does not depend solely on badges and guns, but on the courage of ordinary citizens who refuse to accept that might makes right. He looked directly at Margaret, Elizabeth, Catherine, Mary, and Sarah. These young women faced circumstances that would have broken stronger people. They survived through intelligence, determination, and most importantly, their refusal to abandon each other when abandonment would have been easier. The judge's gavel fell with finality. This court is adjourned and justice is served. As the courtroom erupted in applause, the Henderson sisters found themselves surrounded by well-wishers, newspaper reporters, and offers of assistance from throughout the territory. Publishers wanted their story, lecture circuits wanted their speeches, and several mining companies wanted to hire them as consultants on frontier security. But Margaret, speaking for all her sisters, politely declined most of these opportunities. They had not survived their ordeal to become celebrities or to profit from tragedy. They had survived to honor their father's memory and to build the peaceful life he had wanted for them. The reward money from the capture of Dalton's gang, combined with their share of the recovered treasure, provided the Henderson sisters with financial security they had never known. More importantly, It gave them the freedom to choose their own path forward, rather than being dependent on the charity of others. As they left the courthouse together, Aunt Clara walking beside them with obvious pride, the 5 Henderson sisters looked toward the mountains where their ordeal had taken place. Those peaks no longer represented terror and desperation, but rather the place where they had discovered their own strength and the unbreakable bonds of family love. Their father's badge, recovered from Blackjack Dalton's body, now rested in a place of honor in Aunt Clara's house in Silver Creek, but the values it represented, courage, justice, and service to others, lived on in his daughters who had proven themselves worthy of the Henderson name. 5 years had passed since the Henderson sisters emerged from that abandoned mineshaft in Eagle Valley, forever changed by their encounter with Blackjack Dalton's gang. The small town of Silver Creek had grown considerably during that time, partly due to the increased mining activity that followed the capture of the criminals who had been terrorizing the region, and partly due to the unexpected fame that came with being home to the 5 sisters of Eagle Valley. Margaret Henderson Morrison stood on the porch of the large house she shared with her husband, Marshal Jake Morrison, watching their 2 young children play in the garden that had once been Aunt Clara's vegetable patch. The house had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family and the frequent visits from her sisters, who remained as close as ever despite having built their own lives throughout Colorado Territory. The transformation in Margaret was remarkable. The desperate young woman who had clutched her father's pistol in a dark mine tunnel had become one of the most respected women in Silver Creek, known for her work establishing schools and supporting the families of lawmen who risked their lives, maintaining order on the frontier. Her marriage to Jake Morrison had surprised no one who understood that their partnership had been forged in danger and tested by fire. Their home had become an unofficial headquarters for territorial law enforcement, with marshals and deputies from across Colorado seeking Jake's counsel on difficult cases and Margaret's insights into the criminal mind. The combination of her experience surviving Dalton's gang and her natural intelligence had made her an invaluable consultant on cases involving organized crime and corruption. Elizabeth arrived that morning with her husband, Dr. Samuel Hayes, the physician she had met while doing charity work at the Territorial Hospital in Denver. Their medical practice served mining camps throughout the region, and Elizabeth had become known as one of the few women who could assist in surgery with steady hands that never trembled, no matter how dire the circumstances. The skills she had learned during their night of survival, remaining calm under pressure, making life or death decisions quickly, and never abandoning those who depended on her, had served her well in her chosen profession. The frontier desperately needed medical care, and Elizabeth had pioneered new techniques for treating gunshot wounds and mining injuries that had saved hundreds of lives. Her reputation had spread beyond Colorado Territory, with medical schools in the East requesting her to speak about frontier medicine and the unique challenges of practicing in remote areas. Catherine's arrival created the usual stir in Silver Creek, as it had for the past 3 years since her book 5 Sisters, A True Account of Survival and Justice in the Colorado Territory, had become a bestseller throughout the American West. Publishers in New York continued to demand more books from her. But Catherine had chosen to remain in Colorado, establishing a school for young women that emphasized both traditional education and practical skills for frontier life. Her students learned literature and mathematics alongside marksmanship and survival techniques, creating a new generation of capable frontier women. The Catherine Henderson Academy for Young Ladies had attracted students from as far away as California and Texas, all seeking the unique education that combined refinement with practical resilience. Catherine had also begun work on a second book, This one focusing on the broader issue of corruption in frontier government and the role of ordinary citizens in maintaining justice. Her correspondence with newspapers and reform organizations throughout the country had made her a national voice for governmental accountability and women's participation in civic affairs. Mary had perhaps changed the most dramatically of all. The sisters, the quiet young woman who had preserved their father's emergency supplies and noticed crucial details during their ordeal, had discovered a talent for detective work that surprised everyone, including herself. She now worked as a consulting investigator for the Territorial Marshal's office, specializing in cases involving missing persons and cold crimes. Her ability to observe details others missed, and her intimate knowledge of criminal psychology, gained through their encounter with Dalton's gang, made her invaluable in solving cases that had baffled other investigators. Over the past 5 years, she had been instrumental in solving 17 murder cases, locating 43 missing persons, and breaking up 4 different criminal organizations that had attempted to fill the void left by Dalton's gang. Mary's success had attracted attention from law enforcement agencies throughout the West, and she had been offered positions with the Pinkerton Detective Agency and the Federal Marshal's Service. However, she preferred working independently, taking cases that interested her and maintaining the flexibility to assist her sisters when they needed her expertise. Sarah, the youngest Henderson sister, had chosen a path that honored their fathers. Memory in the most direct way possible. She had become the first woman deputy marshal in Colorado Territory, an appointment that initially caused controversy, but which had proven remarkably successful. Her youth and apparent fragility often caused criminals to underestimate her, a mistake they rarely had the opportunity to repeat. The rock chisel she had wielded so effectively in the mine had been replaced by a Colt .45 that she wore with the same quiet confidence that had carried her through their darkest hours. Sarah's arrest record was exemplary, and her methods had become models for other law enforcement agencies dealing with similar challenges. More than just a deputy marshal, Sarah had become an advocate for victims of violent crime, establishing support systems for families affected by frontier violence and working to ensure that the justice system served everyone equally, regardless of social status or economic position. The occasion for their gathering was both celebratory and solemn. It marked the 5th anniversary of their survival, but also served as the dedication ceremony for the Rebecca Blackwood Memorial Library, funded by the reward money the sisters had received and named after the brave federal agent who had died. Saving their lives, the library project had consumed 2 years of planning and construction, with each sister contributing her expertise to ensure that the building would serve the community's needs for generations to come. Margaret had handled the political negotiations required to secure the land and permits. Elizabeth had overseen the construction with the same attention to detail she brought to medical procedures. Catherine had designed the educational programs and selected the initial collection of books. Mary had investigated the backgrounds of all contractors and suppliers to ensure no corruption entered the project. Sarah had provided security during construction and established protocols for protecting the valuable materials the library would house. As the 5 sisters walked together through the streets of Silver Creek toward the library dedication, they passed landmarks that reminded them of how much their world had changed. The Wells Fargo office now displayed a plaque commemorating Mrs. Blackwood's service, while the local newspaper office featured a permanent exhibit about the case that had exposed corruption throughout the territorial government. The Silver Creek Hotel, where they had once sought refuge as desperate refugees, now bore a small bronze marker noting that it had housed the 5 sisters of Eagle Valley during their time of need. The proprietress, Mrs. Patterson, had become a close family friend and often regaled visitors with stories of the young women who had transformed tragedy into triumph. But it was the cemetery just outside town that held the deepest meaning for the Henderson family. The headstone marking Marshal William Henderson's grave had been joined by a monument to Rebecca Blackwood, both maintained at the sisters' expense and decorated with fresh flowers that testified to the continuing gratitude of the community they had served. "Papa would be proud," Sarah said softly as they paused before their father's grave, a ritual they observed every time they gathered together. "We finished what he started." Margaret nodded, her hand resting on the shoulder of her 3-year-old daughter, who bore her grandfather's name as her middle name. "More than that, we proved that his work wasn't finished when he died. It continued through us." Elizabeth knelt to place fresh flowers on both graves, her medical training having taught her the importance of honoring those who had given their lives for others. "Mrs. Blackwood saved us all. Without her sacrifice, we never would have escaped that stagecoach." Catherine, ever the writer, had been working on a memorial poem dedicated to both their father and Mrs. Blackwood. "I've been thinking about what they had in common," she said thoughtfully. "They both understood that some things are worth dying for, but more importantly, they both believed that those same things are worth living for." Mary, whose investigative work had given her deep insights into human nature, added her own observation. "They both chose to stand between innocent people and those who would harm them. That choice defined who they were." The library dedication drew visitors from throughout Colorado Territory, including several territorial officials, newspaper reporters, and representatives from the Federal Marshal's Service. But the most significant attendees were the dozens of people whose lives had been touched by the sisters' work over the past 5 years. There were families of missing persons whom Mary had found, patients whose lives Elizabeth had saved, young women who had graduated from Catherine's Academy, communities where Sarah had restored law and order, and lawmen's families whom Margaret had supported through difficult times. The library dedication had become an informal reunion of everyone whose life had been improved by the Henderson sisters' decision to turn their survival into service. Judge Augustus Hartley, now retired but still respected throughout the territory, served as the ceremony's keynote speaker. His presence added gravity to the occasion, as he had presided over the trials that had brought justice for their ordeal. 5 years ago, Judge Hartley began, addressing the crowd gathered before the new library. 5 young women faced circumstances that would have broken most people. They could have allowed that experience to embitter them, to make them fearful and withdrawn from the world. Instead, they chose to use their survival as a foundation for service to others. He gestured toward the impressive building behind him, its windows gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. "This library represents more than books and learning. It represents the transformation of tragedy into hope, of survival into service, of personal triumph into community benefit." The library itself was a testament to the sisters' determination to ensure that their experience served a greater purpose than simply surviving. The building contained not only books and educational materials, but also a research center dedicated to documenting the history of law enforcement in the American West. Rebecca Blackwood's undercover reports, carefully preserved despite the violence that had claimed her life, formed the foundation of a collection that would help future generations understand the challenges of bringing civilization to the frontier. A special wing housed the William Henderson Memorial Archives, containing documents, photographs, and artifacts related to frontier law enforcement. The collection included their father's original badge, his case files, and personal items that told the story of one lawman's dedication to justice. Visitors could study the evolution of law enforcement techniques, the challenges faced by frontier communities, and the role of ordinary citizens in maintaining order. During the dedication ceremony, Territorial Governor Samuel Crawford, who had replaced the corrupt officials exposed by the sisters' evidence, spoke about the lasting impact of their courage. "The Henderson sisters proved that justice doesn't always wear a badge," he declared to the assembled crowd. "Sometimes it appears in the form of ordinary citizens who refuse to accept that wrong should triumph over right." The governor's speech was followed by remarks from Marshal Morrison, whose own transformation had been as remarkable as that of his wife and sisters-in-law. "5 years ago, I was a man haunted by failure, convinced that I had somehow let down my partner William Henderson when he was killed. These women taught me that honoring the dead means living up to their example, not drowning in guilt over circumstances beyond our control." But it was Aunt Clara's speech that moved the audience most deeply. Now in her 70s, she had become the unofficial matriarch of Silver Creek, her house serving as a gathering place for the extended Henderson family and a refuge for travelers who needed assistance. Despite her age, her voice remained strong, and her mind sharp as she addressed the crowd. "50 years ago," she began, her words carrying clearly across the gathering, "my brother William left our family farm in Missouri with nothing but a determination to bring law and order to places where both were scarce. He married a wonderful woman, raised 5 daughters, and served communities throughout Kansas and Colorado with distinction. He died believing that his work mattered, but wondering if he had made any real difference." She paused, looking at each of her nieces in turn, her eyes bright with tears of pride. These 5 women are his answer. They proved that the values he lived and died for, courage, justice, family loyalty, and service to others, don't disappear when good people die. They live on in the people they leave behind, multiplying and growing stronger with each generation. Aunt Clara's voice grew stronger as she continued. "William Henderson's legacy isn't carved in stone on a cemetery monument. It's written in the lives of the criminals his daughters helped capture, the corruption they exposed, the missing persons they found, the patients they healed, the students they educated, and the communities they served. It's written in the marriage that grew from shared danger into lasting love, and in the grandchildren who will carry his name and his values into the next century." As the formal ceremony concluded, the crowd was invited to tour the new library. The Henderson sisters found themselves separated as visitors sought them out to share personal stories of how their work had affected their lives. Margaret spoke with several lawmen's wives about the support networks she had established. Elizabeth consulted with doctors about medical techniques she had developed. Catherine discussed educational methods with teachers and school administrators. Mary listened to unsolved cases that local sheriffs hoped she might investigate. Sarah advised younger law enforcement officers about dealing with violent criminals. As the afternoon wore on and the crowd began to thin, the 5 sisters finally found themselves alone together for the first time in months. Their lives had taken them in different directions. Margaret to marriage and motherhood, combined with support for law enforcement families. Elizabeth to frontier medicine and medical innovation. Catherine to education and writing. Mary to detective, work and criminal investigation, and Sarah to law enforcement and victim advocacy. But the bonds forged in that terrifying night underground remained as strong as ever. Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't found that mineshaft? Catherine asked, as they walked slowly through the library's main reading room, admiring the shelves filled with books and the comfortable chairs where community members would gather to learn and study. Mary, whose analytical mind had pondered this question many times, shook her head thoughtfully. "I think we would have found another way to survive. We had each other and Papa's training, and something inside us that refused to give up. The mineshaft was just the means. Our survival came from who we were, not where we hid." Elizabeth, practical as always, added her own perspective. "What matters isn't what might have happened. What matters is what we did with the life we were given after we survived." We could have simply been grateful to be alive and lived quiet, unremarkable lives. Instead, we chose to make our survival meaningful. Sarah, despite being the youngest, often provided the most profound insights. Mrs. Blackwood told us that sometimes good people have to do extraordinary things to stop bad people from winning. I think we proved she was right, but I also think we proved that extraordinary things don't end with one dramatic moment. They continue every day, in every choice we make to help rather than ignore, to serve rather than be served. Margaret, as the eldest, had the final word. We didn't just survive that night in the mine, we discovered who we really were and what we were capable of. Everything good that has happened since, our marriages, our careers, our children, our service to others, it all grew from that discovery. We learned that Henderson women don't break under pressure. We adapt, we endure, and we fight back. As the sun set behind the mountains where their ordeal had taken place, the 5 Henderson sisters stood together in the library that bore their friend's name, looking out through the large windows at the town that had become their home and the community they had helped to build. Their father's badge rested in its place of honor in the memorial archives, but his legacy lived on in the lives they had chosen and the difference they continued to make. The frightened young women who had huddled together in a stagecoach, uncertain about their future and dependent on the charity of an aunt they had never met, had become forces for justice and progress throughout Colorado territory. They had proven that survival was not enough. What mattered was what you did with the life you had fought to preserve. In the distance, a train whistle echoed through the valley, carrying new travelers toward uncertain destinations, just as they had been carried 5 years earlier. But now Silver Creek was a place where such travelers could find safety, justice, and hope, a testament to 5 sisters who had refused to let their father's death be meaningless and who had chosen to build something lasting from the ashes of their tragedy. The Henderson name would endure, not carved on a tombstone in some forgotten cemetery, but written in the institutions they had built, the people they had helped, the justice they had served, and the example they had set for future generations of frontier women. Their father's work was indeed finished, not by his death, but by the daughters who had proven themselves worthy inheritors of everything his badge represented: courage, integrity, service, and an unshakable commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.